In 2023, before the Priscilla Bacon Lodge hospice in Norwich relocated to its new building, something deeply unsettling was unfolding inside its old site. This was not a place known for superstitions or folklore, but a modern hospice, caring for patients in their final days. Yet multiple staff members began reporting experiences they could not explain, figures seen moving through empty corridors, sounds with no source, and an overwhelming sense of presence in areas that should have been silent and still. As these reports accumulated, the atmosphere inside the building grew heavier. Staff spoke of unease, of rooms that felt wrong, of moments where fear appeared without reason. Eventually, the hospice chaplain contacted the Church of England, seeking guidance and support from what are formally known as Deliverance Ministers.
Figures often referred to in popular culture as exorcists.
While no full exorcism was officially carried out, the request itself revealed how serious the situation had become. This was not a rumor spreading online, but internal concern documented in emails and later confirmed by authorities.
What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the sightings themselves, but the setting.
A hospice is a place where life, death, and emotion exist side by side, where boundaries already feel thin.
And in this building, something appeared to cross a line.
Years later, when these documents surfaced publicly, the story reignited a chilling question. When places absorb enough human suffering, grief, and final moments, do they sometimes become something more? Tonight, we begin with this case, not because it is the most violent, but because it is real, documented, and disturbingly close to home. To understand why a place like Priscilla Bacon Lodge would become the center of such disturbing reports, we need to step back and look at a broader pattern, one that appears again and again across cultures, countries, and time periods. Hospitals, hospices, and care facilities are among the most frequently reported locations for unexplained phenomena, not because they are old or abandoned, but because of what happens inside them every single day. These are places where people arrive carrying fear, hope, pain, and unresolved emotions. They are places where lives end quietly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes after long periods of suffering. In many belief systems, moments of death are described as transitional,
points where something shifts, where boundaries between states of existence become thinner.
Whether viewed spiritually, psychologically, or symbolically, hospitals sit at that boundary constantly.
Former nurses and caregivers around the world have described eerily similar experiences, hearing footsteps during night shifts when no one is present, seeing patients who had already passed away, or feeling watched in empty wards. In many cases, these accounts are not shared publicly for years, often dismissed at the time as stress or exhaustion. But when stories from different institutions begin to echo each other in detail, patterns start to form. At Priscilla Bacon Lodge, staff did not immediately jump to supernatural explanations. Reports began quietly, small moments that felt wrong rather than dramatic. A shadow at the edge of vision, a room that felt colder, heavier, resistant. A sense of being observed when alone. These experiences were subtle, but persistent. And persistence is often what turns doubt into concern. Importantly, the hospice itself never claimed the building was haunted. The involvement of Deliverance Ministers was not a declaration of possession, but a precaution, an acknowledgement that whatever was happening was affecting staff morale and emotional well-being. In environments like these, fear spreads quickly, and once fear takes hold, it changes how people perceive space, sound, and silence. Yet even accounting for stress and suggestion, one question remains difficult to dismiss. Why do so many reports describe the same kinds of encounters in places where death is routine?
And why do these experiences often intensify when buildings are about to close, relocate, or undergo major change? Some researchers suggest that it is not death itself that leaves an imprint, but unfinished moments, confusion, attachment, awareness without resolution. Others argue the explanation is entirely human, a product of grief and exhaustion. But there are cases, documented, recorded, and witnessed by multiple people, where neither explanation fully satisfies. And this brings us to a darker, more uncomfortable idea. What if certain places do not just witness human experience, but absorb it? What if walls remember, not as stories, but as sensations? As we move forward, we will leave the hospice behind and examine other locations where similar patterns have emerged, places that were studied, monitored, and even filmed by research teams who expected to find nothing and didn't. Before Priscilla Bacon Lodge became a hospice, the building served a very different purpose, one that would later become central to how staff interpreted what they were experiencing. The site was formerly part of the Jenny Lind Children's Hospital, a medical facility dedicated to treating seriously ill children. For decades, this was a place filled with young patients, long treatments, fear, hope, and, in some cases, death, at an age where life was barely beginning. Children's hospitals occupy a unique space in human psychology. They are places where emotional intensity is constant, not only because of illness, but because of the presence of families, parents, and caregivers experiencing prolonged stress and grief. Unlike adult hospitals, where death is often expected and understood, the death of a child carries a different emotional weight. It leaves behind questions, unfinished moments, and a sense of injustice that is difficult to resolve. When the hospital eventually closed and the site was repurposed, its physical structure remained, but its function changed. Corridors that once echoed with footsteps of nurses and families became quiet.
Rooms that had held children in recovery or decline were redesigned, but not erased. For staff working at the hospice years later, this history was not always immediately known, but once it surfaced, it reframed how the building was perceived. Several staff members later described a subtle but persistent atmosphere within certain areas of the building. It was not described as overtly frightening at first, but as emotionally heavy, as if the space carried a residue of past experiences. Some rooms felt colder, quieter, or resistant, creating discomfort without a clear cause. These sensations were not constant, nor were they dramatic, which made them more difficult to dismiss or explain. Importantly, there is no official record of widespread paranormal claims during the hospital's operation. What makes the later reports significant is not that the building had a dark reputation, but that its history only became relevant after staff began experiencing unease. In other words, the past did not create the stories. The stories led people to look into the past. This distinction matters. It suggests that the experiences were not driven by expectation or suggestion, but by something that manifested first and was rationalized later. For many working in the hospice, learning about the building's former use did not provide comfort. Instead, it introduced a new question: whether spaces that witness intense human emotion can ever truly reset, or whether they carry forward impressions that remain invisible until conditions allow them to surface. As the hospice continued operating, these questions became harder to ignore. The building was calm on the surface, but beneath that calm, something seemed unresolved. And it was within this environment, quiet, controlled, and professionally managed, that staff would soon begin sharing more specific and unsettling accounts, not as stories, but as experiences that followed them through their shifts. As time passed, the unease reported by staff at Priscilla Bacon Lodge began to take on clearer forms. What had started as vague discomfort gradually became specific experiences, repeated by different individuals who had no reason to influence one another. These were not dramatic encounters at first, but moments that lingered, refusing to fade once a shift had ended. Several staff members working night shifts described seeing movement at the far end of corridors that should have been empty. At first, they assumed it was a patient, a colleague, or even a reflection caused by low lighting. But when they approached, the corridors were empty, silent, and undisturbed. Doors remained closed. No footsteps followed. No explanation presented itself. Over time, a recurring description began to emerge. More than one staff member reported seeing what appeared to be a young girl, often described as wearing red, standing briefly in hallways or doorways before disappearing. The sightings were fleeting, lasting only seconds, but they were consistent enough to be discussed quietly among staff. Importantly, these descriptions were not shared publicly at first, nor were they widely known within the building when the earliest reports were made. For those who encountered her, the experience was not described as aggressive or threatening. Instead, it was deeply unsettling in a quieter way. The figure did not speak. She did not approach. She simply appeared, watched, and vanished. This absence of interaction made the sightings harder to rationalize. There was no obvious emotional release, no clear narrative. Only presence, followed by absence. Alongside these sightings, staff reported other disturbances that were more difficult to attribute to stress alone. Doors were found open when they had been closed minutes earlier. Call bells activated in unoccupied rooms. A sense of pressure or heaviness was felt in specific areas, particularly during late hours when the building was quiet and staff numbers were low. Some workers admitted they avoided certain corridors unless absolutely necessary.
What is notable is how staff reacted internally. Rather than panicking or spreading rumors, many questioned themselves first. They considered fatigue, emotional strain, and the psychological toll of hospice work. Some chose not to report their experiences immediately, fearing judgment or professional consequences. But as similar accounts surfaced independently, hesitation gave way to concern. These were trained professionals accustomed to high-stress environments, illness, and death. They were not easily startled, nor were they inclined towards superstition. Yet the persistence of these experiences began to erode confidence in simple explanations. When fear becomes routine, when unease follows people home after their shift ends, it stops being an isolated incident and becomes an operational problem. Eventually, the question facing management was no longer whether the experiences were real, but whether they were affecting staff well-being. In a place dedicated to providing calm and dignity at the end of life, fear, however unexplained, was something that could not be ignored. And it was this accumulation of quiet, consistent reports that led to a decision few expected, a decision that would later draw national attention and spark controversy far beyond the hospice walls. When reports from staff continued to accumulate, management at Priscilla Bacon Lodge faced a situation that could not be resolved through standard procedures. There was no physical threat, no equipment malfunction, and no single incident that could be isolated and corrected. Instead, there was a growing emotional strain, rooted in fear and uncertainty, affecting those responsible for caring for patients at the end of life. At this point, the decision to contact the Church of England was not driven by belief in possession or the supernatural in a cinematic sense. It was a practical response to a human problem. The hospice already employed chaplaincy services as part of holistic care, supporting patients and staff emotionally and spiritually. Turning to the church was an extension of that existing framework, not a declaration that something paranormal had been confirmed. The individuals contacted were not exorcists in the dramatic sense portrayed in horror films. Within the Church of England, they are known as Deliverance Ministers. Their role is primarily pastoral, focused on offering reassurance, prayer, and guidance in situations where people believe a space or individual may be causing distress beyond what can be addressed through medical or psychological means. In most cases, their involvement does not involve rituals, confrontations, or claims of demonic presence. Emails later revealed that the chaplain sought advice on how to bring calm back into the building, not how to remove an entity. There was no emergency, no spectacle, no formal exorcism was requested or performed. Instead, the discussion centered on whether a blessing or spiritual support might help ease anxiety among staff who were struggling to work comfortably in the environment. This distinction is crucial. The story did not begin with the idea of an exorcist. That language emerged later, when internal communications became public and were reframed by media headlines. What was originally a quiet request for guidance became a sensational phrase that carried far more weight than the situation itself initially suggested. For management, the concern was clear. In a hospice, emotional stability is not optional. Staff must feel safe, grounded, and supported, not only for their own well-being, but for the patients they serve. When rational explanations fail to restore confidence, institutions sometimes turn to symbolic actions, gestures that acknowledge fear without validating it as fact. And yet, even symbolic actions raise uncomfortable questions. If a modern NHS facility finds itself considering spiritual intervention, what does that say about the limits of rational systems? Where does responsibility end when fear has no clear source? And at what point does acknowledging belief begin to shape reality itself? These questions would soon follow the hospice beyond its walls, as the story moved from internal concern to public scrutiny, transforming a quiet decision into a national talking point. Once word of the church's involvement reached the media, the story quickly took on a life of its own. Headlines in local and national outlets used words like exorcist and haunted hospice, creating an image far removed from the careful pastoral response that had actually occurred. While staff at Priscilla Bacon Lodge were concerned about the subtle, unexplained sensations in the building, the public perception shifted to something far more dramatic, fueled by curiosity and sensationalism. Articles highlighted the notion of supernatural disturbance, often including references to horror films, particularly the famous Exorcist franchise. This comparison was entirely media-generated. There was no exorcism, no confrontation with a spirit, and no manifestation beyond the fleeting experiences described by staff. Nevertheless, the headlines captured attention, and social media amplified speculation, connecting the story to ghost hunting shows and paranormal forums.
The hospice itself issued statements clarifying the facts, emphasizing that the involvement of Deliverance Ministers was a precautionary measure focused on emotional well-being and reassurance. They confirmed that no rituals were performed, and no individual or patient was believed to be in danger. Despite this, the popular narrative had already been established. An exorcist called to a hospice sounded dramatic, compelling, and frightening, and it overshadowed the reality of the situation. For staff who had lived through the quiet unease of the building, this media portrayal was almost surreal. What had been subtle, professional concern was suddenly presented as a sensational paranormal event, attracting curiosity seekers, journalists, and online commentators. Those who had experienced the phenomenon firsthand found themselves negotiating between the truth of their experiences and the exaggerated stories spreading in the public domain. This divergence between reality and perception highlights a key challenge in reporting unexplained phenomena, even when accounts are restrained, carefully documented, and focused on human experience. Public interpretation often jumps to extremes, seeking mystery and fear rather than understanding. In the case of Priscilla Bacon Lodge, what began as an internal measure to support staff morale became a story shaped by cultural fascination with the supernatural, reinforcing stereotypes and misconceptions about what actually occurred. And yet, even through the noise of media misrepresentation, the essential truth remained. Staff continued their work, patients continued to receive care, and the building continued to function as a hospice. The concern for well-being and professional responsibility persisted, reminding us that real human experience, fear, uncertainty, and emotional strain can be far more powerful and unsettling than any dramatized headline. Looking back at the events surrounding Priscilla Bacon Lodge, it becomes clear that the story is less about supernatural spectacle and more about human experience in a highly charged environment. The building itself, with its history as a children's hospital, carried the echoes of intense emotion, and staff working there were confronted not with ghosts, but with the cumulative weight of human fear, grief, and responsibility. Their reports, consistent yet subtle, were a reflection of the psychological and emotional pressures inherent in caring for the dying, magnified by the quiet, empty spaces of the hospice during night shifts. The decision to contact Deliverance Ministers, often misrepresented in media coverage, was a pragmatic response aimed at restoring a sense of calm and reassurance. It was not an admission of possession or paranormal activity, but a recognition that belief, ritual, and symbolic acts can influence morale and perception, especially in environments where stress is constant and emotions run high. In other words, it was a measure rooted in care and caution rather than fear. From this case, there are lessons for both institutions and the public. For healthcare providers, it demonstrates the importance of acknowledging staff well-being, creating open channels for discussing concerns, and understanding how environments with emotional intensity can affect perception and judgment. For audiences and readers, it highlights how media narratives can quickly amplify fear and misunderstanding, turning measured professional responses into sensationalized stories that distort reality. Ultimately, the story of Priscilla Bacon Lodge is a reminder that the most unsettling experiences are often grounded not in the supernatural, but in human psychology, institutional responsibility, and the spaces we inhabit. Fear and uncertainty can arise even in the most controlled settings, and sometimes, the unknown is simply what we have yet to understand about ourselves and the environments we occupy. If this story unsettled you, take a moment to reflect on the subtle ways human perception can be challenged, and consider the environments where you live and work. Like this video if you found the story compelling, and subscribe for more explorations of real-life events that blur the line between human experience and the unexplained. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we continue to examine events that challenge what we think we know about the world around us.